Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to part three of our Grow Your Wealth series. My name is Amir Baker. I am your host. I am representing the Mu Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And again, I want to thank you guys for coming along this journey with us and talking about the various topics that will help you get to a place, hopefully mentally, financially, where you can make better decisions to help not only obtain wealth, grow wealth, protect it, but then ultimately pass it down. Wanted to just kind of give a brief overview of where we've come from in this conversation so far and why we're here. For many of you who are new, this is part three of a four-part series. This series is meant to give context to our audience in regards to how we go about passing on generational wealth. We hear this term all the time. It's almost been overused and abused. But what does that really mean? Yes, we all think about making money, we think about earning, we think about building businesses and investing. But have we really and truly thought about what mechanisms and procedures have to go into place to actually pass down all that wealth that you've created? And this is where the series was born out of. So in episode one of the series, we talked about obtaining wealth, and much of what we talked about was investing in self. You are the first investment that is necessary in order to obtain wealth, whether that is going to school, advancing your skill sets, starting a business, whatever it might be. You have to invest in you first, all right? And there are other avenues as well. In part two of the series, we talked about growing your wealth. We talked about what kind of investment mechanisms are in place to assist us with getting to our investment goals. We talked about dealing with different investment or wealth professionals, a couple of those different categories, and how they are going to play a part in our journey as well. And today, what we're going to be talking about is protecting that wealth. So you've did the self-investment, you have hired the professionals, you've opened the accounts, you've got money flowing now. And now we want to figure out, how do we protect that wealth? How do we hold on to it long enough to even pass it down? So without further ado, we're going to get right into it. Again, joining me today is going to be our co-host and our speaker for the evening, Mr. Matt Aaron, the owner and operator of Lux Wealth Planning. Thank you for joining me again tonight, Matt.
Absolutely. I'm excited for the conversation.
For sure. So let's get right into it. One of the things that I want to start off talking about is actually a brief recap of something that I think is going to help our viewers kind of be able to contextualize what it is we're going to talk about tonight. And last week, you talked about something that I thought was pretty important. Um, and we talked about different asset classes and things like that. But one of the things that stuck out to me was we talked about depending on where you have your money, there are three types of, I guess, ways that taxes can uh, be taken.
Yep.
Do you mind going through those three different avenues and just kind of giving us something to think about as we go into the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about our assets, different assets get taxed differently. So it's really important that we're aware of where are we locating our money, because where you locate your money can play a significant role in the taxation of that money. And I think that there is no real right or wrong, or let me not say that. There's really no one size fits all. Different places where you put your money have different purposes. So just because, one account might be taxable versus another account might be tax free. So typically you're going to have a taxable account, a tax deferred account, and then a tax free account. And if we're talking about just strictly, let's just call it like basic investment accounts. And if you have a taxable account, it's usually something that we can access. It's accessible, no penalties. It's more for like shorter term goals or midterm goals, or when we've maxed out all the tax deferred and tax free options, because usually the tax deferred and the tax free options are going to have limits. The taxable account almost acts like a spillover where the rest of the assets will go when you really don't have no other place to put them. And so it's just, taxes can erode, your wealth. And it's really important to make sure that at the end of the day, your goals should come first, and that we don't let taxes drive our, taxes. Us trying to not pay taxes should never be the first thought. It should be still starting with what is your goal, and making sure that we're not over indexing on tax savings, and then we find ourselves not actually achieving the desired outcome we want.
I think that's interesting you said that at the end, because we all, I don't know about everyone else, I'll speak for
Yeah.
myself, hate taxes. I don't have any kids, don't have any dependents, I'm not married, and so I get taxed at the highest rate that I possibly can for my tax bracket. And you think that, for people who are trying to be enterprising, right? We live in a free society where the sky is the limit.
Right.
But the higher we get to the sky, the more it seems like we're actually giving our money away. And so I guess that's really what we want to talk about today, is how can we give less of our money away? Because you got to pay taxes, right? Anybody who says they don't pay any taxes is probably doing something a little shady.
Yeah.
Right? So we got to pay some taxes, but we can figure out how to minimize our tax liability. So with that, can you talk about some of the different types of taxes that we pay out?
Yeah, and before I even go into that, I do want to, start off with sharing that I'm not an accountant, I'm not a CPA, I'm not your tax advisor. You should go talk to your own, individual tax advisor, and should get a consult. This is purely education, and us just wanting to share information for the benefit of our community growth. So I just wanted to start that as a disclaimer. But part of financial planning, tax planning plays a role in that. So I'm very knowledgeable about taxes and different mechanisms and ways that we can, try to minimize or reduce our taxes. But to your point, we never want to invade. We just want to make sure that we're maximizing the tax codes, how they, how they can be perceived and defended at the end of the day. Now, there's different types of taxes, and I won't go into all of them, but just when, the most popular, right? We have our income tax we got to pay. We got property taxes we got to pay. We have sales taxes we pay. We have even, we have some even personal property taxes we have to pay. And so now the personal property taxes, that one is going to very much depend on where you live, right? Like, so in certain states, they don't have personal property taxes. So I live in Virginia, and there is personal property taxes, but the income taxes is lower. So it just depends, and so to that point, it really, right, like you have to understand, like, okay, where do I live? You have to understand, okay, where is my money? Okay, you have to understand, how do I make sure that I understand that I am paying? I don't want to volunteer and pay more than what's necessary. And that really just comes down to awareness. And so when we look at income tax, the thing that's interesting, Amir, is that most people think that they're paying a lot in taxes. And I know nobody wants to pay taxes, but relatively, you could be making $1 million and still not be at the highest tax bracket. And a lot of people don't realize that, there's something called marginal tax rates and effective tax rates. And most people don't understand this concept. People Google their income, and then they think that that's what they get taxed at, but that's really not. That's what your last dollar gets taxed. So when we look at taxes, our income gets taxed in bands. So the first, 10,000 might get taxed at one number. The next 30,000 might get taxed at a different number. The next 100, so it goes in bands, and then you divide it and you create an average, and that's what you pay in taxes, is an average. That's your effective tax rate. But most people think that their marginal tax rate is their true tax rate, when it's not. And so if you really look at what the true percentage is, if somebody was to go and look at their W-2s, or if they are a business owner and they looked at how much they paid in taxes, then divide that by their total gross income, they'll be surprised. I bet you most people, are maybe at the no more than 25%.
That's interesting. I actually did not know that. I thought that once you make a certain amount, right, whatever the fiscal year is when it ends, they say, okay, you made $100,000. $100,000 get taxed at this rate, so we take 27% of your 100,000. But you're saying first 10,000 might be 10%, the next 30,000 might be 15%. And then as you go up, you're getting taxed at different rates as your income continues to increase over that period.
Exactly. So like for 2025, it's 12%. Sorry, it's 10%, then 12%, then 22, 24, 32, 35, and 37 for 2025 federal income tax. And then you have your state taxes, which can be a different, it's naturally going to be a different tax based on where you live. And then if you have a business, you can be paying also corporate tax as well. So that's just another thing to know as well, that you may have some business taxes as well that you got to be mindful of.
One other tax that I want to talk about, and this kind of ties this entire series together, and I know we're going to talk about it to some extent next week in our final installment of the series. So I don't want to give away too much, but I do want to touch on this. Talk about probate taxes.
Oh, estate tax.
Estate
Yeah.
tax.
So estate taxes. So on the federal level, right? Most people won't have estate tax, like just most people, but there is something called an estate tax exemption. Okay, so if you're if you're a single person, right, today you get $13.6 million about in exemption, right? And so if you're married, you got about 28, let's just call it 28 million. So that means that for the first 13 million, 13, 14 million, if you're single, if you have assets that are below that level, that's in your name, you won't pay any estate tax on the federal level. If anything above that number is what you will pay estate tax on, which is 40%. So it is a big bite, that you do pay on that excess amount. So, that's where your tax planning and estate planning strategies can help you to reduce that if that is your situation. Now, on the state level, you can have estate taxes on that side, and some states don't have it at all, and some states do. So you just got to look at your local state and see if there is any estate taxes, and if they are, you want to do some planning there too. But it's really important to be proactive about these things and don't let them happen to you. And so it is called the lifetime exemption for a reason, because it's over your lifetime. So that means that you want to start be strategic about how you think about moving around assets so you don't get exposed to that estate tax. And so again, sometimes it doesn't make sense, right? Like, and there's certain assets you do and you may not want to remove from your estate for strategic reasons, right? Like, because if I can't really optimize or capitalize on an asset because I don't own it anymore and I moved it out of my estate, that can be a problem.
So what I want to do is I really want to separate fact from fiction. And the reason why I say is because a lot of people have their ideas about finances and many other topics based on what they see in popular culture, right? We see a lot of movies, we see a lot of TV shows, and people kind of mix reality with Hollywood a bit. And so we talk about moving assets around, right, to protect ourselves from these different tax liabilities. And one of the things that people probably automatically think about is, oh, offshore Swiss bank account, that kind of thing, right? But that's obviously very Hollywood of people to think that way. Can you kind of help us figure out, just based on what most people might have been exposed to versus like what's the reality when we talk about moving around our assets in different places?
I wouldn't play that game. There are just some things that you got to really ask yourself if you want to put yourself in a position that puts you at risk. And as we talk
saw what
about,
happened to Franklin Saint. Sorry, I just want to say we all saw what happened to Franklin Saint.
exactly, right? And so we don't want that situation, and we want to be thoughtful, right? And so again, we don't want to volunteer, but we also want to be thoughtful about allocations of resources and where they're going. Yes, there are things you can do, like I've heard and I've seen people move out of the country and to try to not pay taxes. And if you're not happy, it doesn't matter, to be honest, in my opinion. So it just depends on what your situation is. So it's really hard to give any hard, fast, feedback or advice on that one. But yeah, just do your due diligence. Don't believe everything somebody says. And a lot of times what I find is that people will like listen to something. It could be a podcast, it could be TikTok, and they see a strategy and they think that it's applicable to everyone when it's not, and it's usually not. And that's why it's, individual planning is important. And it's really important that we focus on ourselves and our own situation and not try to, look at everybody else's. So I think collaboration and education is important, but just kind of where's the information coming from? And is that person, really aligned with your best interest when they're sharing that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, right? The TikTok thing. And I don't have a TikTok, but I hear people get a lot of information from there.
Yeah.
And obviously, you have a lot of unsolicited advice, on all kinds of topics, especially when it comes to finances and taxes and things of that nature. And you always hear, see one of these 30-second or 60-second videos, and somebody says, if you take this and you do that and you put it in here and you add the two, you'll have this outcome.
Yeah.
And it seems so simple, and it's like, well, if it was that easy, why isn't everybody doing it? And that's always the first thing that I think about when I hear some of this unsolicited advice. And so can you kind of tell our audience like about the pitfalls of, because while that what they might be saying is actually a true statement, they don't give you the background information on who does this apply to, when does it apply, when does it actually make sense for this rule to actually come into play. And so can you kind of just tell our audience like the risks of taking unsolicited information without doing their research, without consulting a professional, and how that might end up for them?
Well, I would say, pain is the price of progress, right? And you can't skip that step. And I think a lot of times people want the 15-second reel to come to life. And I get it, right? Even from the marketing side, right? The person only got 15 seconds to catch your attention to bring you in. But when the reality is that it's going to take work. I don't care what it is. There's no free lunch, right? And so sometimes even as a culture, we hear about like other culture, other people doing things, and you're like, well, they don't got to pay any taxes. Why I got to pay taxes? When the reality is the only reason why maybe that they don't pay taxes is because they have a better foundation that they're building off of, and they don't need to create income because they already have assets. So if you already have assets, it's possible to not pay taxes because you're collateralizing your assets to buy other, there's different things that they might have available to them. But at some point, somebody along the journey in their family had to pay taxes because they had to create the income to then buy the asset someday. And so we all have to pay taxes at some point, at some entry point. But the question is are we doing the work to save and invest and do the things to build the assets that can put us in a position to then maybe not pay as much taxes or reduce taxes, or maybe a year. It is possible for you to pay no taxes in a year, but that's because maybe you did something strategically, like bought an asset that you were able to depreciate, and now that was written off your income. Things like that, you can absolutely do, and it helps, but you've got to set yourself up to do those things. So that means the pain is you paying taxes. So I always tell people when you pay taxes, you're basically buying, you're buying yourself progress, if you look at it from that lens, as long as you don't spend the rest. But a lot of times people pay taxes and they spend all the rest of it. Now they can't put themselves in a position to actually be more tax strategic because they don't have anything to be tax strategic with or about.
Okay, and I think that's a perfect segue. We were talking about taxes, and we were talking about all these different ways to mitigate our tax liability. And I want to talk about risk management for a minute, but I want you to define for our audience, when it comes to wealth management, what exactly is risk?
All right, this is my jam because a lot of time, when and I didn't make this up. I just remembered it from learning it from somewhere. But a guy, I was reading a book or listening to a podcast, and a guy once said, he said the what he would contribute to all of his dumb tax is excessive optimism, unexamined assumptions, and no risk management. So I'll say that again: excessive optimism, unexamined assumptions, and no risk management. And we all, and I'm all for being optimistic, but you want to be the most humble, optimistic, with caution person, because it's not about how much you make, it's how much you keep. And a lot of times people want to try to take home run hits every time, or they leave themselves exposed. And that is not how you build wealth nor keep wealth. And you'll be surprised that some of the wealthiest people are actually the people who are the most risk averse, because they didn't try to actually do the sexy thing. Like they kept it simple. They might, on the outside it might seem fancy, but it's really not. Like, they just were very well capitalized and positioned in a way that allowed them to execute maybe on something that they specialize in. But outside of that, they're really not doing that much of new stuff. And a lot of times we try to jump from this thing to next thing. And all we're doing is, every time you switch to something new, you're exposing yourself to more risk, period. And I think that we never give ourselves the opportunity to go all the way through. Anything with enough time, you will get lucky. Most people just don't give anything enough time. And so even if you think about, like, if you think about, like, okay, if we were looking at a 20-year time horizon, right? In year 5, it was going to be a win. On year 9, it was going to be a win. On year 14, it was going to be a win. In year 17, it was going to be a win. And all of those, if you got all of those wins, you would have accomplished everything you desired. And then on the other days, you would have lost. But the wins on the days that I mentioned, they outperform the bad days. And so overall, you're winning. But what happens is that people try to time things and try to say, like, okay, can I like rig it effectively? Like, and that's where people are trying to avoid the pain of the process and think that they can time things, but when you really can't, because nobody can predict the future, right? And everything has an ability to change. And so we have to be optimistic about the future. We have to have hope, right? We got to have hope and courage to keep doing, keep taking bets and shots on goal. But we have to do it consistently every time, because you don't know when those years are going to come where that could have been your breakthrough, or those years where the markets was up and the market and it kind of outperformed the bad years. But that is what's important when we talk about risk management, is focusing on what you can control, and then position yourself to never have to take permanent losses, right? Win a learn, never lose.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned, and you kind of said it in some other words, right, is you got people who try to hit the home run like right out the gate. My new philosophy, and I had to learn this the hard way, I'm one of those people who, I'm not risk averse. Give me all the risk. I'm learning to be a little bit more risk averse now. But my new philosophy on many things, especially when it comes to any investment that I make, is one first down at a time. Everybody wants to hit the Hail Mary. Everybody wants to make the touchdown. You could throw 4 Hail Marys and never catch one of them. But if we focus on that first down, we'll eventually get into the end zone. And so, like, that's now my new mentality when I think about investing, is let's just get the small wins and let the small wins add up to that big win in year 5, year 14, year 17, across our 20-year time period, or whatever it might be. And so I would encourage our listeners out there as well to maybe take that approach of allowing those small wins to just compound instead of trying to get rich quick, essentially.
Exactly. Because it never works. It never works. And when it works, they lose it usually, because they don't know that it was luck that got them rich quick the first time. So the second time it doesn't happen and they're bummed about it. Right. And so I just think we got to manage our expectations around what's required, because you can reduce your risk significantly if you're willing to wait and put the time in. And sometimes expectations just are off completely. Not even sometimes, most of the time.
I think what you said too, there's pain in the progress or something to that nature. I think that's very true as well, because I truly believe that if you are going to rise up the financial ladder, you're going to deal with losses. It's much different when you're playing the game of I'm working within $100,000 income range. I might lose 5,000 here, and oh, that hurts. But imagine you're dealing with $1 million budget. You're losing 50,000. That hurts a whole lot. You know what I mean? And so, depending on where you're playing the game at, loss is inevitable, right? But if you don't go through that pain of making progress, then you'll never really be able to handle those type of losses and still be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, and losses really is all relative, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the person with 100,000, if they lose, quote unquote, if they lose 5 or 10,000, it still feels the same because it's all relative, right? Because if I have 1 million and I lose, 50, it's no different than if I have 100 and I lose five. It still feels because that's what I'm anchoring to. I'm anchoring to that, and so I think that sometimes we, lose sight of that too.
Okay, so can we talk about some of the risk management strategies that uh, would be beneficial to our listeners today? Oh,
Yeah, I mean, first things first is just having cash, right? Having access to capital for emergencies. Typically you want to have 3 to 6 months of living expenses in a bank. If you're single, you definitely want to have 6 months. If you're married, and you and your spouse manage finances together, I would say, you can probably get away with 3 months if y'all make the same exact income. If y'all don't make the same income, then you kind of have to balance it out. Maybe it has to be 4.5 months, depending on what the income difference is. Also, so that's on the emergency funds because at the end of the day, like, you want to make sure that you don't have to go on credit card debt to solve a problem. And, they say the average American only has $1,000 to solve an emergency, and so we got to do a better job at, again, the basics, right? And that means we got to manage our cash flow. And even managing your cash flow is a risk management strategy, right? Because if you're not spending all of your money, that means you could take a pay cut for a period of time to so that you can, maybe pivot in your career or, buy, that business or, there's just a lot of things you can do when you build in margins in your cash flow. But if you're check to check, all you need is one thing that will go wrong and then it's hard to recover quickly. And that's the benefits of, making sure that we are conscious of our cash flow and having cash reserves. Secondly, one of the most underappreciated insurances that I think is extremely important is disability insurance. I think that, when we think about what is our most important asset, well, that's us, right? Like we get car insurance, we get homeowners insurance, we get, insurance on our phones, but we don't protect our biggest asset, which is us. And I think that's extremely important because if I get sick or injured, I need the money to still keep coming in, not only to pay expenses, but to also save and invest. You can lose hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're just out for a year, right? Because it's the money that you're not saving. It's the money that you're probably having to spend more on, medical expenses. It's the money that's not now being invested. So you're missing out on all that compounding growth. And that's going to be a huge loss. And then the last one that I'll mention before you jump back in with any other questions is life insurance, right? I'm tired of seeing GoFundMe's, and I get it. And like, look, I understand the vehicle and I understand, but we got to take responsibility and we got to plan in advance, right? We got to do what we need to do so that our families can just focus on, uh, putting us to rest and being able to mourn, not fundraising, right? Like that's not what's supposed to happen during that time. And so I think it's important that we do that and then we really understand, which life insurance makes sense for my situation. There is no one size fits all, right? Like you're going to find stuff online, again, on TikTok and all these other things about different insurances, but you got to understand your situation and not all insurances are good. And so I think it's just important for people to understand that context is everything.
Now, I know that obviously this is all for educational purposes. So I'm going to ask you a question. I am looking for your professional input, but again, to our audience, this is just for educational purposes. Still seek out a professional on your own. What is the difference between somebody who is single, no kids, and what their insurance kind of setup might look like versus somebody who has a family, wife, kids, a house together, things like that? Kind of what does that look like for those two different groups of people?
Yeah, great question. Well, one, I think everybody needs to protect their income, right? Unless you just literally don't depend on it and you don't care to protect it. But I personally think that you should protect as much as they're willing to allow you to protect. My opinion is I can't let the insurance companies care about me and like willing to benefit. I can't let the insurance companies willing to value my life more than I value it, right? And so I try to get as much insurance, disability income insurance as possible. And I think that's for anybody, whether you're single or married. The second piece is relates to, let's say, like life insurance. Well, on that side, it depends. Depends on, like, I had life insurance before I was married, right? And even before I was in a relationship with my wife. And so I think that the question is like foresight. Like, I was young and healthy, and I'm still young and healthy, so I keep getting more insurance as long as they're willing to give it to me. Now, I think it's important though to not overextend yourself. If you're single, there's no reason for you to go crazy and get crazy amount of life insurance. But you might say, you know what, just in case I get sick or I get sick, I don't want to pay a crazy premiums later because I didn't. So I just like the idea of locking in insurability. And later down the road, you might decide to expand it, change it to different types, but you don't want, in my opinion, like our insurability is very fragile. So I just like to try to get that taken care of early. But if you're married and you have kids and people depend on you, you should absolutely make sure you're replacing your value creation that you're doing on day to day that's contributing to your home, and so that way, God forbid, if something happens to you, that capital is ready to go, and they can focus on just mourning, and they can make sure that they're still achieving the dreams and everything else you hope for them.
Yeah, no, I agree with you as well. I also had the foresight right out of college. I just started racking up the insurance policies. And again, because I knew somewhere I learned, I came to a talk like this, and somebody dropped a nugget, and they pretty much said it's much cheaper to get all the insurances you can get while you're young and healthy, pay a lower premium, hold on to them, versus trying to get them at 40, at 50, where your health is not necessarily the best. And so you're going to pay a more premium price for a more higher tier of insurance. So I did the same thing. Um, and I just put my immediate family as my beneficiaries. But
Mhm.
something I want to run past you and get your thoughts on. I had a mentor about 10 years ago. He came to give a talk at Howard University Business School, and he was speaking about how one of the greatest levels of wealth transfer takes place in death. And he was talking about how when you think about the disparity between um, African Americans and uh, the white folks in America and this wealth gap that exists, he said one of the things that white people had from very early on is they were able to get insurance. And so
Mhm.
every generation that passed was able to essentially pass down something in
Mhm.
death, right? Not even the assets that they had gotten while they were alive, whatever houses or land, but in death, like boom, mom and dad got $1 million policy each. Each of their kids are getting, a piece of that, right? $2 million split between two kids, three kids, whatever the case might be. And so generation after generation continue to grow and pass down wealth just through insurance.
Mhm.
Obviously other ways, but specifically I'm talking about insurance. And so I know that in our culture, talking about death is very taboo. But it seems
Yeah.
that other cultures are not as worried about speaking about death and speaking about how can you in your death benefit the rest of your legacy. I want to ask you one, how does someone approach having that kind of conversation, whether you're having that with your spouse, whether you're having that with your parents or whomever? And then how can we leverage something like insurance to actually be able to put ourselves in a position to pass down a significant amount of money to the next generation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first things first, that we have to understand that like other communities are human too, right? And what I mean by that is like white people don't like paying for insurance either. Like we got clients that are white and like and they don't like paying for insurance either. It's not that people, it's just the question is like, do you have other people who are influencing you in a positive way that can help you to understand and appreciate it's just something you should do? I don't like paying for my insurance either. You know, it's not that I enjoy it. I just want the benefits of it. Right. And so I think we have to shift our mindset and not look at it as, okay, I'm paying for insurance, but no, you're paying for a desired outcome, which is if something happens to me, I want to make sure my family is good. And so if I'm working hard every day to do that, to build for them, then yeah, I should probably then, if I'm not here, want the same thing. And and so I think it's just a very selfless thing to do, by getting the right adequate insurance and not leaving anybody to deal with your your mess when you go on. And I think also that it's important that we look at how can, those tools be a vehicle for change. And you got to just, I think the mistake a lot of people make is that they don't when the life insurance comes through, they don't have a real like what we call a family constitution, but they don't have like uh, almost like a playbook of like what should I be doing with this money. They just get the lump sum of money and then they might not even have it for very long. So it's important for you to have a game plan for the money. How should it be used, and who should you become as a result of the money? I look at it as like a gift of love. And that's how my letter starts. Like when if something happens to me, it's a gift of love that I'm giving to my family.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. And for those listeners who are on here right now, if you were not in the very first session, you heard Matt talk about a family constitution. And in session one, we broke that down in great detail and talked about that game plan that we must have. It's a conversation that we have to have as a family. If you're here and you're listening to this conversation, that means you're interested in a lasting legacy. You are interested in making sure that your loved ones are taken care of, that your grandkids, whomever, your favorite, charity, whomever it might be, that in your um, in your eventual demise, that all your affairs are taken care of, and the people who you love the most aren't paying the price. And that family constitution, having that conversation and having that playbook about if this then that, or here's how this is structured, and everyone knowing how to navigate that particular space, because once you're gone, that's a horrible time to try to for everyone to try to pull together and figure out, well, what insurance did he have, what assets did he have, who has access to their bank accounts, what did he have overseas, all these different things. And it's already hard enough to mourn somebody, but imagine having to mourn somebody and have to deal with the money. And so that's why, like, next week we're going to talk about how we go about passing things down. But in this particular conversation here, we're talking about protecting wealth. And I think that one of the things that I want to drive home to the listeners, you mentioned disability. And I think that I want to make sure I didn't go over people's heads, because when we talk about protecting wealth, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, if you if something happens to you on the job and you are no longer able to make income, or your business burns down and something like that, anything could happen, and you don't have a means to continue to provide for yourself, provide for your regular expenses, you start eating away at all the assets that you have just to try to maintain, right? Instead of having something in place that will supplement or replace that lost income without you having to start to diminish what you've already amassed. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Exactly, 100%. And I think that we have to also understand the power of momentum, right? And so if you have to go backwards and you got to erode your assets that you work hard to accumulate. Like think about how long it took for you to accumulate the assets you currently have. So like if the average person only have $1,000, right? Like, and you now are losing thousands of dollars every month due to a loss of income, that's significant, right? That's significant. Even if you got $100,000, how long did it take for you to accumulate 100,000? Probably a meaningful amount of time, or whatever the number is. I bet it's longer than what you would like. Just whatever that number is, divided by 100, because that's how long it's going to take for you to do it again. Because you just eroded, so you're not getting all that compounding. You got to start the clock all over again, right? And so it's important for us to understand that it's not just a short-term thing, right? Like short-term disability is different than like you going on long-term, like after 90 days, after 188. So basically after 3 to 6 months, because your emergency fund is done, right? So the goal would be if I have 3 to 6 months of an emergency fund, that plus my short-term disability, I'm good. It's the long-term that most people don't think about. And here's a stat for you. There's a 25% chance that we're going to be sick or injured at some point. We just don't know when. 25% chance. That means if it was 2 more people on this Zoom, on this recording with us, or this live with us, that one of us are going to be out of work. We just don't know when. That 25% is a high percentage. Right now, dying prematurely, because we often talk about life insurance, and I believe it's extremely important. But disability insurance, it's a selfish thing to do, because the money is actually coming for you. It's for you. So you need to be able to do that, because most people think also that they got disability insurance at work. And you might have disability insurance at work, but normally it's only about 60% of your income. And even then, you got to get taxed on it most of the time because the job pays for it. So you might only take home about 45%. So if you're not saving 50% of your check right now, what do you think you're going to do when your income gets cut in half?
Yeah, I agree. And that's something that, again, coming to a conversation like this and just somebody putting a nugget in my head, I realized, yes, my job is only going to give me a certain percentage of my total income, right? But my lifestyle is based on my total income. So I have other insurances or things in place that also have those same features of disability insurance. So I might get 60% of my check from the job, but I'm also going to get 60% of my check from this entity and that entity. And turns out I might actually end up with more money under disability than I did actually when I was working. I've seen it happen.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, the insurance companies try to stray away from it because they don't want you an incentive to not go to work, right? Because then you sipping daiquiri somewhere while you're collecting a check. But that
They don't need
they
to worry about what I do with my money.
yeah, so they do, because when you're applying, they ask for all of that information. So typically you're not going to be able to go over 90%, but sometimes you can get away with it. Like if you're a business owner, and you had, let's say, individual disability insurance, and then you go and you have now group insurance from somewhere else, you can basically have more coverage than your income. So it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, even going from 60 to 90 is still a big leap. So just
Yep.
having multiple avenues, the redundancy, if you will, to make sure that you can lessen the impact as much as possible. Because I think if you're on disability, you're going to feel an impact somewhere, somehow, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people think they're gonna be out you like can't do nothing, and that's usually not the case, right? Usually it's something you could have got diagnosed with something. Like we had somebody who unfortunately got into a car accident, and they can't do one aspect of their job, and that job was like, well, I hired you for that thing, and as a result, like this person is not working anymore. And so the beauty though is that the type of policy she had, it allowed her to actually go work and do something else. And so she is able to claim her disability check, and she does another job and claim that check. So that's kind of cool. But most disability coverages will reduce your benefit if you are making income somewhere else. It just depends. So not
That's
all, yeah.
understandable.
So just with that being said, though, right? Like not all insurances are created equal, and that's why you have to do the due diligence. Like look at the details of the policies and know what riders do you have, right? Like is it inflation protected? Is it you know. Well, yeah, so like it's just different features you can add to all of these policies, and that's why having a professional is so key.
And I was just getting ready to get into that because last week we talked about professionals in the context of growing your wealth, but would these still be the same ones that are in charge of protecting your wealth, or is there a different type of professional that we should be seeking out to, like, hey, this guy makes the money, but this guy protects the money, or can they be one and the same? How does that look?
It can be the same person. It just depends on the firm and the organization that they are working with or that they run or own. So some like advisors only do insurance. Some advisors only do investments. Some do both. Some planners only do the financial planning, but you have to get the implementation done somewhere else. So it's definitely different structures out there. You just got to ask. But it's important that that person is still working in your best interest, right? When they are, recommending insurance. And, I think it's not, unfortunately, it's not uncommon for us to see, people maybe not making the best recommendations. So I think it's just important to really understand, the why behind the recommendation, right? And truly seeking clarity. Everybody's situation is different again, and so you can't think because this person told you or advised you to do something, and you go and ask somebody else, oh, are you doing this? And then they say no, or they say why they're not doing it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And then same vice versa. And so I think that you have to really, um one, trust this person, and you got to do your due diligence.
I got a question for you before we get into some questions from the audience. Let's say you're dealing with someone who is very cash heavy, right? They make their money freelancing, so they get paid in cash and checks, and they tend to just put their money in a bank. Let's even say they can make tens of thousands of dollars at a time, right? They're making 50,000 a day, 100,000 the next day, 80,000, or week to week or month to month,
Hmm.
and so they're very cash heavy. They have no idea what they want to do with the money or where they should put the money, but they want to make sure they protect it. They want to make sure, like, hey, my lifestyle only costs me 10,000 a month, but I'm making 80, and I need to figure out, how can I protect this liquidity that I have? Because liquidity, I think, is important as well when we talk about being ready to invest in certain things in certain times. But obviously, we don't want to hold a lot of cash, right? Because of inflation and things like that. So, just real quickly, for those people who might be entrepreneurs who are making, cash hand to hand, how could they begin to devise a plan of action for getting less cash being liquid in their bank accounts that's actually losing value, and starting to move it into places that would at least maintain the value of that cash or maybe even grow it incrementally over time without the help of a tax professional? It's something that they could possibly look into doing on their own, that they can manage themselves.
I probably wouldn't recommend that in terms of them trying to manage it on their own, especially if they're a business owner. You just don't have the time. That's the reality. You don't. I'm a business owner. I don't manage my own stuff. You just don't have the time to manage your stuff. And especially when we're talking about like storing capital and being strategic from that standpoint, because there are tools out there, right, where you can store your capital, still have access to capital liquidity to be able to use for growth or for a rainy day or, opportunity capital. But you don't want to put yourself in a position where you make the bad move on this capital, and now you need money for the business, and now your business fails because you didn't have the money, or so we got to be really, we got to be thoughtful about that. And I think that ultimately, going to a financial planner who can educate you on different ways of doing that. Now, again, this is where it's tough because that financial planner may or may not really understand all the tools that are available to them, right, or to you. And so I think it's important, or that the financial planner, maybe those investments or insurance or whatever is not available through them, that might also be another red flag that, that maybe they're a little biased about that. So I think that you do need to seek out a professional if you're a business owner and you're trying to like store capital in different places for access to capital while still letting it grow. Outside of like, of course, like a regular high yield savings account. Because if we're talking like, again, getting real savvy with it, you definitely want to make sure that those things or whatever the tools are, making sure that it's structured appropriately and it's optimized for, for you and your benefit and your plans.
Okay, I got a question from one of the viewers, and I think this ties back to some of that stuff I was saying about sometimes uh, there's always these videos on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, wherever, and there's always these financial gurus giving you all kinds of tips: invest in this, buy this, buy that. So somebody asked, what do you think about unconventional asset classes, like where people park money in places that are maybe like buying classic watches like Rolexes, or investing in crypto, or buying precious metals as a way to hedge against inflation or to store capital, maybe not in cash, but in something else? What do you think about those unconventional asset classes, and do they play a significant role in both planning?
Yeah, well, I would say, there's always a place, right, for most investments. The question is like, is it with you? And so if most people probably shouldn't deviate from, basic investments, like the boring stuff, right? Because the more, you start doing things that are, I call it the shiny belt, right? Like you end up putting yourself at risk that you don't fully understand, whether it's access and liquidity. Like, for example, like, I have a Rolex. I couldn't, like, yeah, I could sell this thing probably pretty quickly, but I couldn't just sell it tomorrow though. Like, and try to be able to solve a problem that I have tomorrow. So it just depends on what the money is for. And again, I probably wouldn't even sell this watch because I like the watch. Like I want to use those things like a watch as less of an investment and more like, yes, does it have value? Yes. But is it usable value? No, because I'm not selling it because I want to use it for myself. And so I think that, we just got to be realistic with ourselves around like the utility of the thing, and do we fully understand it? Because I think just most people are not sophisticated investors to really understand it. And so, and most people are not doing the basics. So just do the basics first. Like, are you funny? If you're not financially independent or on a glide path towards financial independence, you should just be in some base, you should have a basic high yield savings account for emergencies, and you need to invest in, a well managed, not, it wasn't be managed by somebody, but a well diversified investment, funds to make sure that it's tracking towards your goals, whether it's short, mid, or long.
All right, I got one more question for you before we begin to close out. Can you talk about, and this is one that I just came up with because I think it's important. Can you talk about how managing your personal lifestyle plays a role in asset protection? Because sometimes I think we can do ourselves a disservice by trying to keep up with the Joneses, by buying things that we think are valuable, but really they lose a lot more value than they hold, and so things like that. And so I just want people to kind of understand, because I think this is something we can all relate to. Just talk to us about how managing our lifestyle and our lifestyle expectations can assist us with protecting our wealth.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably one of the most important things you can do as it relates to wealth planning. Managing the lifestyle creep is what we like to call it. As you earn more, we tend to rise to those earnings and spend more. Just think about it. If we all reflected on what we used to spend when we first came out of school and college to what we spend now for things. And again, I'm not saying that you can't increase your lifestyle, but if you're not already on track to at least be able to retire, right? Like if you're not saving and investing enough to be able to retire at 65, right? Then in my opinion, you don't need to increase your lifestyle at all. It should stay there. And every time you get a pay raise, you should just be socking away the money until you hit a rate in which you're on track. So let's say if you're off track and you're only saving $200 a month. Well, that's not going to solve your retirement, right? So maybe you need to be saving $1,500 a month out of your total income to be on track for retirement, right? And so if you can't save that 200 and you now are making an extra, and you need 1,500, now you're making an extra $1,300. Now that extra $1,300, that has to go 100% to playing catch up. And then when you're on track, every extra dollar you earn, you can take 50, spend it. The other 50, you need to save it. And you'll always be on track at that point.
Excellent. I appreciate your insight, Matt. So as we close out, I wanted to make sure our viewers know next week will be our final installment of this 4-part series. Next week, we'll actually talk about the act of passing down the wealth. And I just want you to just touch real quick on what our viewers can expect to talk about next week so they can prepare their questions and just maybe have some insight as to what they might want to get out of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So next week, we're going to be spending time talking about legacy. What does that really mean to me and what I typically see that meaning for other families. We'll also we'll be hitting on the family office structures and how we can all build our own family offices and start to take more ownership of value creation and passing on that value creation from a legacy standpoint. And we'll also be talking about estate planning, some basic estate planning things that are important as it relates to making sure that we protect our assets and our values, and those things are getting passed down so that the actual generational wealth can come to life, and then it perpetuates multiple generations, which is really the real goal that we should desire.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate your time. As always, I appreciate your expertise, your diligence, and just adding so much value to this conversation. To our audience, thank you for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you in our final installment. If you have just joined us for the first time, please go to our YouTube, go to our mulambda.org/live, go to our LinkedIn, and please check out the earlier 2 episodes so that you'll be coming prepared next week to really finish off this conversation and have a good idea of how to get your way to passing down generational wealth. And with that, I say good night.